Tonight, the Objectivist Club invites Dr. Eric Daniels to make a case that capitalism is the only moral social system. He is a research assistant professor at Clemson University's Institute for the Study of Capitalism and has lectured internationally on American history, particularly on American intellectual history, business history, and political history. He taught for 5 years at Duke University's program on values and ethics in the marketplace, where he was nominated for a university-wide teaching award. Dr. Daniels was a contributor to the recently published Oxford Companion to United States History and wrote a chapter in The Abolition of Antitrust. He has appeared on C-SPAN and Voice of America Radio. So please will help me to welcome Dr. Daniels.
Well, thank you for coming out tonight. I, as Natalia said, have a somewhat unusual task in that what I'm going to attempt to demonstrate to you or explain to you is why capitalism is in fact the only moral social system. And to do this, in a sense, I want to take a page out of Karl Marx's book. Karl Marx actually was the inventor of the word capitalism as we know it today, so we can at least credit him with that. And one of the things that Marx developed, one of his main ideas, was that people under a system of capitalism, particularly the laboring classes, would be plagued by a problem that he called false consciousness. Right? That people would misunderstand the system, that they would, while they were being oppressed by it, in fact not understand fully their position in the social system until such point as he believed the proletariat would attain class consciousness and break through that false consciousness and then ultimately rebel and set up first a system of socialism and then ultimately a system of pure communism. What I actually think, though, is that Marx had it a bit wrong. There is, in some important sense, a false consciousness about capitalism today that people have. What it is, however, is entirely the opposite of what Marx expected. Instead of individuals not benefiting from the system, being exploited by the system, and fundamentally supporting it, which is what he believed false consciousness ultimately was, that people would mistakenly believe that capitalism was good for them, even though it was in fact oppressing them, the reality is just the opposite. People, in fact, benefit from capitalism, but capitalism lately, particularly lately, has gotten something of a bad rap. And there's an interesting story behind this. Going all the way back to before the financial crisis, which is when capitalism particularly has been blamed for market crashes, for bank failures, for people losing their homes, for unemployment, for all kinds of economic problems. The centerpiece of most criticism always turns back to the case that unregulated capitalism is at the root of all of these problems. Now, this is a tough case to make. Why would anyone want to argue that capitalism was a good thing? Not only a good thing, but a moral thing. So this is where we have to actually start getting into the understanding of what people first mean by capitalism, why people don't support capitalism, and why the people who do support capitalism perhaps have mistaken that case. Why they haven't fully developed the right argument in favor of capitalism. So that's what I want to do tonight, is just to review some of those ideas about what capitalism actually is, how people view it, and why they've gotten the case wrong. Why, indeed, if we can borrow from Marx on this count, they have false consciousness. So the irony here is that if you look at some of the surveys about capitalism, if you look at what people actually say when they're asked about capitalism, a recent Rasmussen survey asked Americans whether they thought that they would prefer to live under a or whether they were unsure which system they would prefer. And among Americans, the response rate was that about 53% of Americans said, given those choices, I would rather live in a system of capitalism. And 20% said I would rather live in a system of socialism, and then the remaining 27% said that they were unsure. But the interesting thing, the really interesting thing that I think, particularly in the context of a college campus, is when you actually look at those numbers for people under the age of 30. If you break out that survey and you say, what did people say who were actually under the age of 30, the future of the country? Well, in this case, only 37% of those surveyed said that they supported capitalism. 33% said they supported a system of socialism, and 30% were unsure. About the same rate of uncertainty on both young and older Americans, but a far less committed sense of commitment to capitalism. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when you ask people a different term, right, a polling is always about how you ask the question. When you ask people whether they support free markets, right? Freedom, of course, is a big key word there. There's a far higher response rate that people do support this. So on the one hand, we already have a disconnect between the idea of what is capitalism and what might a free market be. One of the things that we notice is that there's often conditional support for what people mean when they say capitalism. They like capitalism, as the story goes, on the way up, when the profits are there, but they don't like capitalism on the way down, when the tough times come, when business losses start rolling in. People want to privatize the gains, they want to socialize the losses, in other words. It's great when you're making money and you want capitalism on the way up, but then when things are tough, you want everybody else to help take care of you. So there's a kind of ambivalence. Now the question that we ultimately have to ask is, why is there this ambivalence? Why do people have this uncertainty about whether capitalism actually is good for their lives or not? Well, the problem, I think, is not what people expect it to be. The problem is not, in a certain sense, that the system of capitalism, a free market economy, is misunderstood, the way that it actually functions. Right? There have been literally dozens of Nobel Prizes in economics that have been about research on how markets function. People understand how wage markets and labor markets function. They understand how international trade functions. The system of capitalism, as it works as an economic system, is probably the most well understood economic system of any time in history. Right? We understand how capitalism actually functions, how markets function. Right? You ask economists, and this survey has been done since the 1970s, there's more unanimity on the part of professional economists about certain economic policies, like the minimum wage, et cetera, than there is in the general public. Economists have figured this out. The question is, why don't people support capitalism if the system is so well understood? And in fact, it's not just understood, but it actually it supports the idea that capitalism works on an economic level. So the story sort of leads us to the question, it's not about how capitalism works then. It's not enough, or it's not certainly sufficient to explain to people, hey, wage markets work, labor markets work, international trade works on an economic level. Right? We can draw equations and graphs and things on the board and explain how capitalism as an economic system actually functions. But that doesn't seem to have penetrated through to the level of supporting capitalism. And so one of the questions that we have to ask is, why is it that when the solutions to some of these economic problems that exist in the country today, some of the problems like, what do we do about Social Security? Right? I always ask my students, how many of them actually think that by the time they reach retirement age, there will actually be any money left for them to collect Social Security? I mean, how many people under the age of 25 in this room think that by the time they reach 65, that there will actually be money in the Social Security fund left for you to collect?
It's already empty, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's already empty. I mean, so in other words, you don't even think that people of retirement age today, right? So you say, how do we solve this problem? Right? This is not something that's a grand mystery. This problem in many ways has actually already been solved. If you look at the example of Chile, for instance, economists devised a way of gradually privatizing and desocializing their retirement system. And in Chile today, there's more retirement security for retired workers than there is in any other of the modern westernized nations. Right? They figured out how to privatize it, and that model is there. Very well-trained economists from the University of Chicago devised a system, privatized their retirement system. It was a lot like Social Security. They privatized the system. They gave people the choice, who were already in the system, whether to opt out, and then they gave people the choice entering the system. So these are not difficult in the terms of economic problems. The question is, why won't people support it? And the answer to this actually comes down to looking at both the proponents, or the supposed proponents of capitalism on the one hand, and the opponents of capitalism, and then looking at what kinds of arguments they actually make. It's not just about, hey, do you support capitalism, do you oppose capitalism? The question is, why do people who support capitalism, or claim to support capitalism, do so? And why do people who don't support capitalism, who think that it's a bad thing, do so? Well, it's fairly easy if you look at the history of critics of capitalism. Of course, we have to start with the grandfather of them all, Karl Marx. Marx was one of the first economists to criticize what he then dubbed the system of capitalism. Marx, basically, in the middle of the 19th century, alleged the following. Capitalism, he said, would exploit and impoverish workers by perpetually paying them subsistence wages and subjecting them to grinding poverty. Capitalism, in other words, would ultimately push down the working classes so far
in terms of their wages and their living conditions, that ultimately those working classes would get larger and larger and they would revolt. Right? This is the oncoming communist revolution that Marx foretold. So Marx's criticism is the primary problem with capitalism is that the wages and the products of labor aren't fairly distributed. In other words, the workers are getting not only not enough, but less and less over time. But if you fast forward, say, to the late 19th century, after Marx had already died, and after some more experience with industrial capitalism had been put on the world stage, and you ask critics of capitalism toward the late 19th and early 20th century, what is their main criticism? Right? They can't say that it impoverishes workers, because the example in Britain, in France, in Germany, especially in the United States, was that individuals who worked under a system of capitalism were not being impoverished. In fact, their standards of living were rising. So at the turn of the century, Thorstein Veblen, another critic of capitalism, another economist, criticized capitalism because he said, although it raised aggregate standards, living standards, it funneled still too much wealth to the elite. So he had to recognize that in fact, more wealth was in fact going to the working classes, but not enough. Right? That it was not quite Marx's nightmare scenario, but it still wasn't what he considered to be a just system. By the middle of the 20th century, in the United States, when wealth had become literally abundant to the point that was unprecedented in history, John Kenneth Galbraith, another critic of capitalism, another economist, noted that the fruits of capitalism's incredible productivity, which he acknowledged, he called his book The Affluent Society, the fruits of capitalism were going too often to private purposes for both the working and the elite classes, and not enough to public purposes. There weren't enough parks, there weren't enough roads, there weren't enough so-called public goods, because people were too often privatizing the abundance, the affluence that capitalism brought. Now, in the early part of the 21st century, if you turn to some of the cutting-edge critics of capitalism, right, not the ones that are simply repeating the arguments that have been around since the early part of the 19th century, but they're real cutting edge, and you ask, what do they criticize? People like Barry Schwartz and Oliver James, names you might not even know. They criticize capitalism, get this, because it produces too much, right? They say that there's an actual modern psychological disorder that results from capitalism. They call it affluenza. They say literally you're stultified by the fact that you have too many choices about what soup to buy. You go to the store and there's 54 varieties of canned soup. Right? Now you tell someone in the old Soviet Union, there's 54 varieties of canned soup and it's always there on the shelf, ready to get. Right? And they say in America and westernized nations, this choice overwhelms us. It literally gets to the point where it becomes a psychosis, that we become paralyzed by the fact that we have choices about so much in our lives. So capitalism now, by the early part of the 21st century, is not being criticized, right, because of what Marx said, that it impoverishes workers. In fact, it enriches everyone to the point where, in fact, there are problems of supposed overabundance. Now, underlying that thread, if you start to try to dig down below some of the false economic predictions of these criticisms, and you actually look at what these authors were saying, their criticism of capitalism comes down to a moral criticism. They don't criticize the economic system because they have to recognize the facts on the ground. The reality is that the standard of living of even the most impoverished American worker today is above the average, the median worker in India, for example. And it's so far above historical standards as to even be silly by comparison. Right? The average American today, even at lower working class standards, is far richer than the vast majority of human beings that have ever lived on this planet. So the comparison is the facts on the ground. Economically, wealth is being produced and it is being distributed. It's not just accumulating to 1%. It's literally going throughout all of these classes. The criticism, though, is about things, like what's fair, what is just, right? What is an equitable distribution of wealth, right? Not about whether wealth is actually being produced, one of the surface criticisms. So let's say, what do we get when we turn to the people who supposedly support capitalism? Obviously, these individuals must champion the ideas of the market, say that it is a fair system, that it is the most moral system. But in fact, if we look at the people who support capitalism, often they support it solely on economic grounds. They support the idea that business is productive. They support the idea that people get more stuff under capitalism. That wage markets, for example, work better when there are no controls. That trade works better when there's freedom than when there are tariffs. Right? They focus on the economic case and leave aside the moral case for capitalism. They focus exclusively on things like aggregate standards of living, availability of goods, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that that hasn't convinced anyone. There's still this underlying problem about what's fair, what's just. In other words, there's this problem about the moral case for capitalism. The case that isn't being made popularly by those frequently associated with capitalism is that they're not making the moral case. Right? If you look at the people that are traditionally associated with the pro-capitalist side in the media today and in politics today, they're typically people who are more pro-business than they are necessarily pro-capitalism. Right? I differentiate the two. They're not the same thing. Right? The nomination, the Republican nominee for president, Mitt Romney, right? A businessman who, in fact, had a hard time in the media even defending what it was that he did in his business, right? Private equity. He didn't seem to have a way of defending this except talking about the economic case. He didn't want to talk about why it was better, why it was moral. He apologized for it. The supporters, or the so-called supporters of capitalism, frequently make moral apologies. They know that in a certain essential way, capitalism is about something that makes people uncomfortable. Self-interest. Capitalism is something that builds upon, depends upon, and in fact, in some ways, one might say, enshrines the principle of self-interest. The principle that each one of you should go after what is best for you as a moral primary. Capitalism ultimately rests upon that, and that makes people uncomfortable. The idea of saying it's good for you, and you should pursue it. Right? Not what's good for the group, not what's good for the whole, what's good for the nation, but what's good for you. And so this moral defense has been lacking. Those who typically defend capitalism defend it on efficiency grounds, not on the grounds of morality. Look at the way businessmen are depicted, right? They're in the movies, in television, right, in popular culture. Businessmen are the nasty, backstabbing, grind people into the ground, do anything to make a buck, right? And then you have people who say, oh, capitalism is all about promoting business. You say, well, why would anyone support capitalism if these are the paragons of capitalism? People who would stab people in the back, murder people, trick, take handouts from the government, trick the legislatures into benefiting their businesses as opposed to others. You say, if this is the paragon of capitalism, why would anyone support it? Because they're doing what are obviously immoral things. People feel guilty about that. They think if I'm left free to pursue my rational self-interest in an open and free market, I might be like that guy in the movies. I might be like that nasty villain on television. I might do those things. So far better to have a system that controls me, leaves me less free, so I don't have to worry about my own conscience of whether I'm a good person or not. But what if the system of capitalism was not just about that efficiency? What if capitalism properly understood? Understood in a way more fundamental than merely the economic case. Much as my friends in the economics profession like to think that their field is everything and the full story, there's more to it. Of course, the case for capitalism rests upon the fact that it actually works, but there's more. And that more, I think, comes best articulated from Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, in her novels and in her later nonfiction writings, explained what I think is a relatively revolutionary case for capitalism. It starts from entirely different premises. Rand's case for capitalism actually starts by asking questions that precede the field of economics. Right? If you look up the idea of what economics is, if you look up what the idea of capitalism is defined as, right? Capitalism typically, Rand observed all the way back in the 1960s, she said, capitalism is typically defined as the system of private property that allocates resources according to market prices. Right? That's a fair definition today, that it's about distributing, and economists like to define these as land, labor, and capital. Right? These are the inputs into a capitalist system. You have a price system. You have people competing, as they like to say, infinite wants and scarce resources. And the price system, the system of the market, is how those things take place. And then that's where the study of economics builds up. As I said, these Nobel Prizes, these sophisticated equations that explain how that actually takes place with hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, is in a very elaborate science. But Rand says there's a problem here. If that's how you're going to defend capitalism, there's a very, very important problem. There's a prior question that needs to be asked of how to do that. Right? If you go back to those inputs, land, labor, and capital, focus on that last one, capital. And then focus on the middle one, labor. Think about what these things actually mean. Land is pretty easy. We're just talking about natural resources, right? Capital, of course, is the result of accumulated wealth. Natural resources are pretty easy. Of course, they have to be extracted, they have to be refined. We don't find iPods lying in the woods and just pull them off a tree and start turning them on and whatnot. They actually have to be created. But what about that middle one? Right? If the whole study of economics is about how to balance these various inputs, the question is, what about this labor one? What goes into labor? Does labor always exist? Do people labor for any purposes, for any wages, under any conditions? Right? You have to say, what in fact creates the conditions whereby people wish to contribute their productivity to a goal of producing things for trade, which is the system of the market. They don't just do so automatically. In fact, throughout most of human history, people didn't want to produce for trade. They wanted to produce for self-consumption. They wanted to produce in order to be able to survive. Convincing someone that they should produce on the assumption that someone else benevolently will trade with them, value for value, and do so in a way that benefits both of their lives is a huge assumption. And there's something that has to take place before people are willing to do that. So what Rand noted is that most defenses of capitalism started almost in a way midstream. They started from the perspective that an economy already existed, and the only problem was how to allocate resources. Rand wanted to ask, what is the system that sets up the economy? What is actually the social system? The deeper rooted system that actually supports a market. Because as we've discovered, and as she probably could have predicted, sometimes in world history we see situations where a non-market based economy, right, take Soviet Russia for example, or many of the Eastern Bloc countries, liberate themselves from the type of governmental control that prevents a market from adhering, and suddenly try to institute market dynamics. It doesn't always work. Right? In Russia, it took and it's still very, very painful. All you have to do is go on YouTube and watch these videos of these guys driving around in their cars with their little dash cams and the crazy things that happen in Russia right now. It's really astounding. It's hard to do markets. Right? It's hard to assume that if I give you money on the assumption that 30 days from now you're going to deliver me a good, if I have no trust in people, if I don't know that in a court system, if you don't deliver those goods in 30 days, that I can have an objective hearing where a judge will arbitrate between our claims and settle our case appropriately, if I don't have that trust, if I don't have that system, if I don't have that underlying social system, I may not actually function in that system. Markets won't function in that system. You have guys driving around with baseball bats and chainsaws and weird things in their trunks that they pull out at any time when they get mad at some of these other drivers and whatnot, crazy stuff that happens in Russia. Right? I mean, some of you have seen this. It's astounding, the kind of breakdown of civil society. Right? And you can't just institute capitalism, there's a social system. So Rand says, what is this social system? Under what conditions does capitalism actually work? Right? And so the analogy that I like to draw, the view of economics without defining the social system, without defining how things get done, it's kind of like the Santa Claus view of an economy. Right? Santa Claus's main job is figuring out who's naughty, who's nice. He's got a big sack of goods, right? And he distributes them. Right? He is the economy. Right? As an economy says, it rewards people who are productive, and it doesn't reward people who aren't. It has a big list. It's all about the distribution of goods. But you want to actually take the elves' view of the economy. Where do those goods come from anyway? Do the elves always produce the goods? Do they go on strike when Santa asks too much of them? I mean, the view of the economy as though Santa just hands out goods is like saying that there's just this big pile of stuff. And the economy is nothing but a machine that distributes and allocates this stuff. But people, real people, in real situations actually have to produce that stuff. Why? This is the question that Rand asked. She says, let's step backwards for a second. Why do people produce stuff? She observes that among all of the creatures, among all of the animals in the world, human beings, like many of the rest of the creatures in the world, have to produce things, have to find sustenance. But unlike other creatures, human beings have a very unique factor, right? The rational factor, our minds. One of the unique things about human beings, when you consider them as just sort of naked with nature out there, what do? You don't have claws, you don't have very good teeth, you're not very fast, at least most of us. You probably can't take down prey very easily. Right? You have to actually figure out how to survive. You don't know whether the red berries or the blue ones are the ones that are going to kill you. You have to experiment, you have to discover. You have to figure out how to build buildings like this. You have to understand the principles of science and engineering and chemistry and biology and all the things that go into allowing human beings to survive. Now, why do people do this? Why would people be willing to do this? to engage in a process of production by using their rational faculty to produce things that they're willing to trade with other people to mutual benefit. What Rand observes is they do so, but only under certain conditions. Right? That mind, that productive capacity of human beings to go from literally finding food every day to actually being able to create gourmet meals, right? The difference between mere survival and subsistence to flourishing. Right? The way that happens, she says, is only under a system of freedom. There's a unique thing about the social system that conditions all of the economic relationships, whether or not individuals are free. She makes an observation about the human mind, that it works best, and in fact only works fully, under a system of freedom, under a social system which protects freedom. Ultimately, what she says is that means protection of individual rights. Because when you impose force on the mind, when you tell people what to think, what to do, what to believe, you stop that rational process. Right, as I tell my students in Clemson, I can easily make all of them wear Gamecock gear and pretend like they like the University of South Carolina, which of course sends them into fits. Right, the idea that I can ban them from wearing orange, which all these other things. And I say, yeah, but I can do this, right? I can compel you. I can impose force. I can, I can threaten to kick you in the knee, right? I can hold a gun to your head and I can say, do this, and you can do that.